A fog lies thick over Elcombe Hall, where silence is not peace, but memory refusing to fade. Beneath its rotting eaves, footsteps echo where no one should walk, and a gathering meant to reconcile will instead unearth what time tried to bury. Where in the world are you listening from, and what hour finds you now? Let me know in the comments. The clock has stopped. The house is waiting. Let's begin the story. Harold Swithenbank sat precisely as he always did at 4:30, back ramrod straight, chair drawn squarely to the oaken desk, blotter aligned with military precision, as if some silent court might observe him at any moment. The winter light poured in sluggishly, grey and uninspired, not quite bothering to touch the floor. He was nearly finished with a reply to a tedious inquiry from a provincial solicitor when the envelope was delivered, ivory, thick, and curiously unmarked apart from the name. He turned it over once before opening it. The handwriting, elegant and thin, belonged to a generation no longer favored by typewriters or secretaries. As he read, a slow shadow crept behind his eyes. Elcombe Hall. That place again. He folded the letter carefully, replaced it in the envelope, and rested his fingertips lightly on it. A quarter of a minute passed, then he drew a sheet of paper and wrote a brief note to his housekeeper, requesting his valise be readied for a Saturday departure. His handwriting, unlike the invitation, was legal, stern, incurious, and yet, beneath his composure, something had shifted, something not quite fear, and not quite guilt. A weight, perhaps, unearthed by the curve of a certain signature. The bedsit off Blackstock Road had long since given up trying to disguise its austerity. Damp crept in beneath the window panes, and the wallpaper, once striped, now bore the complexion of neglected ledgers. Miles Carrow sat in a hard-backed chair, cigarette held between fingers he had not washed since morning, and read the invitation for a third time. His smile was slight and without warmth. Elcombe Hall. It had taken them long enough to remember he existed. He drew the envelope's edge down the line of his jaw and stared at nothing for a while. The fire had gone out overnight. No one had lit it again. There was something theatrical in the way he placed the letter on the mantel, propped at a precise angle, as if it were a trophy or a warrant. Then he crossed to the small desk in the corner and opened a drawer. A locked tin box sat within. He unlocked it with a key from a string round his neck and removed a folded photograph, a group of men in uniform, some smiling, some not. He stared at it for a long time, as the draught from the window lifted the letter slightly, then let it fall. Miss Vi took tea precisely at 4, the same as her employer, the Dowager Lady Malvern, who had once been described in the Morning Post as charmingly immovable. The tea service was delicate, blue-rimmed, chipped at the lip of the milk jug. The invitation had arrived with the second post. Miss Vi did not open it immediately. She set it on her lap while she poured the tea, added a touch of milk, stirred counterclockwise. When she did open it, her lips pressed briefly together, forming the semblance of thought. Elcombe Hall. A place not spoken of, only remembered. She read the letter again, more slowly this time. A flicker passed behind her eyes, not surprise precisely, but recognition, worn and painful. She folded the letter into her reticule, finished her tea, and looked across the room to where the Dowager's hand trembled slightly over her embroidery. Francis Linton wore his reputation with the care of a well-tailored suit, smooth, unobtrusive, expensive without shouting. In the back room of the gallery near Cavendish Square, he held the envelope in one hand while discussing the provenance of a disputed 18th-century miniature with a junior partner. When he unfolded the invitation and read its contents, he gave a quiet chuckle. "Elcombe," he said mildly. Now there's a name to stir the dust. He tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his double-breasted coat and returned to discussing brushwork and wax seals, but a slight pause had crept into his voice. His thoughts, unspoken, had turned elsewhere, to a dining room, long ago, and a glass of port he had refused to drink. The Paddington room was serviceable, clean, and wholly impersonal, exactly as Lieutenant Edwin Sharp preferred. He had not hung any pictures, his kit was always squared, his uniform, long since out of use, remained in its original garment bag at the foot of the wardrobe. The invitation, when it arrived, was slipped under the door. He read it once, blinked, then read it again. Then quite suddenly, he opened the drawer of his writing desk and withdrew an older envelope, long yellowed at the edges, addressed in the same thin hand. Elcombe Hall, it read in a firmer time. He opened it, though he had memorized the words years ago. He burned neither letter. Instead, he packed carefully, pressing each fold smooth, the way he had been taught. And when he was done, he took out a tin cigarette case, held it a moment, and placed it in his breast pocket, though he no longer smoked. The maid knew better than to comment on Miss Georgina's expression. It had a habit of tightening just before travel, a prelude to confrontation or calculation. She waited patiently while Miss Darracott reread the letter by the window, the morning sun catching the silver at her temples. "Well," said Miss Darracott softly, "they finally rung the bell." Then more briskly to the maid, "You may prepare the blue trunk. I imagine will require 2 days' wear." The maid nodded and left, passing down the corridor lined with faded watercolors, some of them, if rumor served, once destined for Elcombe's walls. Georgina remained where she was, one finger pressed to the glass, following a trail of condensation as it slid toward the sill. Her face, caught in the light, revealed nothing. The memo was brief and unsigned, a clipped note passed from desk to desk, eventually landing beneath Superintendent Battle's teacup just after 11. He lifted the cup, read the note, and said nothing. "Mrs. Leontine Carrow hosting weekend at Elcombe. Guests of interest, please remain aware." Battle reread it once. Then he reached into a drawer, pulled out a small index card file, and thumbed through names. He paused when he came to Carrow. Miles, formerly military, possibly political connection, watch list inactive, since 1928. He placed the card to one side, folded the note, and replaced it precisely where it had lain. He did not ring for tea, nor summon anyone. He simply leaned back in his chair, and stared out the high window into a London morning grown white with rain, his face unreadable, and his thoughts, as always, entirely his own. The mist had thickened by late afternoon, blanketing the drive in a pale, persistent hush that swallowed the approach of each vehicle in turn. From the high windows of Elcombe Hall, only the occasional flicker of carriage lamps hinted at arrivals, like distant lanterns adrift on some inland sea. The gravel crunched in brief spurts, then fell silent again, as if the house itself resisted being disturbed. The first to arrive was Miss Darracott, swathed in grey wool and silence, offering no complaint as the footman, a boy barely of age, took her case. She glanced once at the heavy front door as it closed behind her, eyes narrowing at the familiar tarnish on the brass knocker. Moments later came Linton, immaculate and unhurried, offering the boy a coin which was refused with a stiff nod. Behind him, Lieutenant Sharp emerged from a dark motor car, the lapels of his coat drawn high, his left hand tucked absently into his pocket. Miles Carrow's cab arrived with an engine wheeze and a whiff of neglect. He stepped out slowly, surveyed the house, and gave a short, inaudible laugh. Only Miss Vi, last to arrive, paused on the front steps before entering, as though listening for something that no longer made noise. The hall retained its proportions but not its warmth. Once richly carpeted, the floor now bore thin runners, and the occasional threadbare patch where grander furnishings had stood. The chandelier above was dimmed, whether by design or economy, one could not say. There were flowers, but few, fire but little, and no footman apart from the boy, who came and went without speaking. Miss Darracott frowned at the cold beneath her gloves, murmured something about draughts, and declined tea. Linton ran a finger across the mantel in the library and remarked, to no one in particular, that the place had lost its edge. Sharp stood still near the hearth, studying the smoke's ascent, while Miss Vi glanced at the clock and seemed to count the seconds between ticks. The house did not creak, nor groan, nor complain. It simply endured, as if the past had weighed too heavily on it to bother with protest. It was not neglect, it was decision. Mrs. Carrow greeted her guests one by one in the smaller salon, which had once been used for musical afternoons, and now smelled faintly of liniment and lavender. She was smaller than memory allowed, and much paler, but her eyes had lost none of their clarity. They met each guest's gaze with precision, polite, assessing, not unkind. To Miles she said, "You've your uncle's shoulders though not his patience," and turned away before he could reply. To Georgina Darracott, "The Darracott chin has grown gentler with age." Linton received a nod and a remark about his gallery's recent litigation. Miss Vi earned no more than a slight pause, and an almost imperceptible tilt of the head, which she returned. Only Sharp was greeted without comment, only a single look that seemed to hold more than it gave. There was no false warmth in her manner, but nor was there hostility. Rather it felt like the turning of pages in a private ledger, names, events, decisions recorded with a hand too steady to forget. Dinner was served in the long dining room, though only a quarter of the table was set. The candelabras were half filled, and the service, while adequate, lacked the polish of former years. Still, plates arrived on time, and the wine was decanted with reverence, if not quite ceremony. The guests made polite conversation, weather, crossings, recent changes to estate tax law, but none sustained the thread for long. Linton made a modest jest about the sherry, which Georgina ignored. Miles spoke only to ask for salt. Sharp cut his meat with the exactitude of a man trained to do so with less forgiving instruments. Miss Vi picked at her food, drank water, and glanced once briefly at the empty chair to Mrs. Carrow's right. It was near the end of the meal, just as dessert was set, that the hostess lifted her glass and said, "To unfinished obligations." The toast was not echoed. Forks paused mid-air. A glass was set down with the faintest chime. Mrs. Carrow smiled, thinly, and sipped. The drawing-room after dinner had not changed in 40 years. The same dark wood panels, the same low fire, the same carefully arranged chairs that permitted conversation without ever quite encouraging it. On the far wall above the piano no longer used, hung the portrait of Colonel Edmund Carrow in full dress uniform, painted just weeks before his departure to France. The artist had captured him precisely. The rigid jaw, the faint furrow above the brow, the medals a touch too glossy, and eyes that followed. It had been said by some, at the time of his death, that the portrait was too severe. Others thought it just. Now, as the guests moved through the room, avoiding the center, they did not speak of the painting, but each looked at it, Miles briefly, with something like disdain. Linton with polite detachment, Miss Vi not at all. The eyes above the piano seemed not to judge, but to remember. It was nearly midnight when Miss Vi left her room to fetch a book she had left in the parlor. The house had settled into its nocturnal stillness, the peculiar hush of places too large for their occupants. The carpet muffled her steps, though she made no effort to walk quietly. At the head of the main stair she paused. There was no wind, yet the flame in the wall sconce beside her flickered, and in that moment she thought she heard something. A soft tread, not heavy, not rushed, but deliberate. It came from the east wing where none were housed. She turned her head toward the long corridor barred by a velvet rope. Nothing stirred, and the door to the east wing remained shut. But the sound had been there, or had it? She lingered for several seconds, her hand on the banister, the sound of her own breath louder than it ought to be. Then slowly she descended. Behind her, a door clicked shut, not loudly, not theatrically, simply and completely, the way all final things do. She turned, but the corridor was empty. The sconce had gone still. The silence was complete again, though altered, as if something had taken its place within it. She remained there for a time, listening. The air, colder than before, carried the faint scent of lavender and something older. The house was not empty, but then it never truly had been. The house woke late, as old houses do when they sense something has shifted. Breakfast was not laid in the dining room. The maid had overslept, and once roused said nothing of the dream that had plagued her, nor of the distant sound of coughing she had heard in the early hours. The corridor leading to the library was oddly still, its silence thick, expectant. The door to the library remained shut, though the fire had clearly been lit within. The faint, acrid scent of smoke clung to the air in the hallway, different from the clean wood smoke of the drawing-room. It was mixed with something sharper, something medicinal. The footman, passing with a tray of linen, hesitated once outside the door, then moved on. Downstairs, Miss Darracott had already taken her tea in the smaller parlor. Linton arrived late, oddly pale. The others filtered in, each remarking without emphasis on Miles's absence. It was not until the housemaid attempted to dust the mantel in the library that the matter ceased to be unspoken. Miles Carrow was seated by the fireplace, one leg crossed over the other in the pose of a man prepared to speak. The port beside him remained untouched. His head was tilted slightly, not in thought, but in something that seemed, at first, like mild surprise. The maid stepped backward without a sound, set down her cloth, and walked carefully into the hall. She did not scream. Her training forbade it. Moments later the butler entered, nodded once, and withdrew. He had been dead some hours. That much was evident from the waxen quality of the hands, from the way the coals had burned low, and from the faint sheen around the rim of the glass. His expression was not one of pain, but of something unfinished, perhaps a word unsaid, or a decision made too late. Sharp was the first guest to arrive. He said nothing, merely bowed his head, then turned to the window. Georgina asked for tea and was refused. Miss Vi stood apart, looking not at the body but at the book Miles had held in his lap, now resting face down, its spine unbroken. It was Dora, the younger housemaid, who noticed it first. While clearing the hearth, she paused, frowned, and looked closer. The petals were dry, browned at the edges, brittle. She picked one up between thumb and forefinger, crumbling it without meaning to. "Foxglove," said the butler quietly behind her. "Odd season for it." He said nothing more. The petals had fallen where they should not have, tucked behind the andirons, not carried in by draught or clothing. No fresh cut flowers had adorned the room in weeks. Dora, who had helped clear the east garden only 3 days before, knew none grew there now. She did not speak of what she suspected. She placed the crumbled remains gently in a dustpan, swept the rest into the bin, and wiped the area clean. Later she would think of it again, but not yet. For now the ritual of work was enough to hold uncertainty at bay. Mrs. Carrow received the news with the composure of one who had long practiced the art of reaction. She sat in the morning room, her hands folded loosely over a copy of the Times, unread. When the butler informed her of Miles's death, she did not rise. "Ring for the constable," she said, "and ensure no one attempts to leave the grounds, not yet." Her voice was clear, firm, and without tremor. She gave no additional instructions, she asked no questions. To those who observed her, Linton among them, it seemed her reaction bordered on indifference. But Battle, when later told of the moment, would ask only one thing: did she look surprised? And the answer would be no, not surprised. She remained seated for some time after the message was delivered, one hand resting on the arm of the chair. Eventually she folded the paper and placed it on the side table. It was the only gesture she made. The message reached Battle in the late morning, relayed through discreet hands and coded in bureaucratic phrasing: unexpected fatality, isolated estate, guest list of political sensitivity. He was in Rye at the time, inspecting the books of a mismanaged shipping trust whose irregularities were dull but predictable. The death at Elcombe was not. He said nothing aloud. He closed the ledger before him, nodded at the junior inspector, and stepped into the hallway. The rain had begun, thin at first, then heavier. The journey inland took longer than usual: 2 flooded lanes, a stalled lorry, but Battle remained placid throughout, reading a discarded racing form without interest. By the time the motor turned onto the long gravel drive of Elcombe Hall, the sky had darkened to the color of old pewter. Battle alighted without haste, noted the drawn curtains on the upper floor, and adjusted his hat against the rain. The butler greeted him with the professionalism of a man who expected answers but would never ask for them. Battle gave his name, entered the house, and let the silence tell him what it might. The moor roads closed slowly, like a trap in reverse. First a tree down on the lower pass. Then a culvert overflowed. Finally, the telephone lines gave out, not snapped but heavy with water, their voices reduced to static. By dusk, it was official: no car would make it out until morning, and no assistance would arrive before then. The guests gathered in the drawing-room once more, their conversation thinner now, more fractured. There was no pretense of shared mourning. Linton reviewed train timetables that no longer mattered. Georgina made a single call to her solicitor before the line failed. Sharp sat apart, carving slow arcs in the arm of the chair with his thumbnail. Miss Vi declined supper. Mrs. Carrow took hers in her room. Battle remained unobtrusive, watching, not the guests themselves but the spaces between them, how some were careful not to sit too close, how others avoided glancing at the clock. It was not yet 8, and already the house had grown smaller, and the storm, steady now, gave no indication it would end. Battle made no introductions, offered no reassurances, and never once referred to himself by title. He simply moved, as was his habit, with a deliberate unobtrusiveness that invited neither evasion nor resistance. The house, unnerved by silence, responded not with protest, but with a faint shrinking, a drawing in of breath, before the question was even asked. He spoke little, content to remain present rather than intrusive, and in that quiet presence he took measure. Georgina Darracott, who gripped the porcelain of her teacup too tightly. Linton, whose glance swept the hallway mirror more often than the faces around him. Miss Vi, who moved with a feline care that suggested she had long grown accustomed to watching doors and judging the distance between footsteps. He asked no questions that day. He merely listened to the rhythm of breakfast, to the politeness of regret, to the subtle hesitations that fell like faint dust between remarks. When Miles was mentioned, it was always with a curious precision of tone, neither fond nor condemning. That, too, he noted. The silence was not of mourning, it was the kind that suggests the room remembers what its occupants try to forget. The military files arrived that afternoon from the War Office. Battle had long since mastered the art of requesting without ever appearing to require. Miles Carrow's record was clean, if thin: promotions, reassignment, an honorable discharge. It was only in the margin of a casualty report that a name had been scrawled: Matilda Vale, nurse cord, deceased 1917. He located the file through quieter channels. Vale's death had been recorded as suicide by drowning, no foul play suspected. The case had never reached inquiry. There had been whispers, of course, a private affair gone sour, a rumor of forged letters, nothing ever proven, nothing ever pursued. But Battle noted the date, 12 days after a disciplinary board had cleared Miles of misconduct. He also noted that the board's notes had since been sealed. He said nothing aloud, only circled the name once in pencil, laid the sheet atop his other papers, and went to take tea. When he passed through the hallway near the service stairs, a door closed quietly behind him, too quietly for coincidence. The solicitor, Mr. Troughton, arrived in the evening, a man of orderly collars and moderate opinions. His briefcase bore the weather poorly, though he did not mention it. He removed the will from a stiff envelope with the ceremony of a man trained to both reveal and conceal. The document was clear. Mrs. Carrow had intended to revise the terms of inheritance, reducing Miles's share to a modest annuity and assigning the majority of the estate to a veteran's trust. The draft bore her initials on every page, but the final signature was absent. "Prepared the day before the gathering," Troughton murmured. She did not sign it that evening, said she preferred to do so once the guests had departed. A sentiment not uncommon among women of her generation. Battle asked no further questions. He merely nodded. The timing mattered, not because of legal consequence, but because of what it revealed: a hesitation, or perhaps a fear. That, too, was a kind of testament. Swithenbank wore his barrister's face as easily as he wore his collar, not stiff, but invulnerable. His conversation was courteous, measured, and so precise as to draw attention to the very thing it omitted. He spoke of Miles's legal dealings, contracts left unsigned, disputes avoided, legacies held in trust. But when Battle asked with casual detachment whether Mr. Carrow had ever mentioned any regret regarding his service record, the reply was slower. "I was not his confessor," Swithenbank said eventually, and Miles was not a man to indulge in self-reflection. He preferred to press forward, regardless of the terrain. Battle did not press. The silence that followed served him better than a dozen denials. Swithenbank adjusted his cufflinks, as if to reassert control, but the moment had passed. In law, as in grief, what was omitted carried the greatest weight. Miss Vi received Battle in the morning room, seated with such poise it might have passed for comfort. She offered tea, which he declined. Her voice was steady, low, and without embellishment. "Yes," she said, "I was engaged to Mr. Carrow some time ago. It was a brief arrangement, ended by mutual understanding. We were not compatible." The tone was almost rehearsed, neither bitter nor bruised. But when Battle gently mentioned the Colonel's name, a flicker passed across her expression, not surprise, but something older. Her lips compressed slightly. "He disapproved," she said, after a pause. But then Colonel Carrow disapproved of most things not issued to him in uniform. Battle inclined his head. He did not correct her use of the present tense. It had told him what he needed to know. Dora met Battle in the scullery, her hands damp from rinsing brass polish into the sink. She was a quiet girl, loyal and steady, not given to drama. But when he asked whether she had ever entered the East Wing, her composure frayed slightly. No, sir, not since before the war. Nobody goes there now. The doors are locked, yet you've heard something. She hesitated, glanced toward the window as though half expecting dusk to answer for her. It's never quiet in that wing, not properly. Some nights you hear footsteps, not heavy ones, not like boots, just walking, and voices, not loud, but you know when someone's talking who oughtn't be. He asked nothing further. She seemed relieved, though not reassured. She dried her hands and returned to her work, humming a tune he recognized, but could not name. The grandfather clock in the main hall was tall, handsome, and dead. Its hands, frozen at 4:07, had not moved in years. Dust rimmed the faceplate, and one weight had slipped from its chain. Battle examined it as one might examine a headstone curiously, without intrusion. The time was noted in the colonel's file, 4:07 p.m., confirmed by telegram. His death had occurred just past the hour of a routine inspection. He touched the casing. The wood was cold. The silence it held was not emptiness, but memory. Some clocks did not tick, because they had nothing left to say. Others because they had said too much. He stepped back, folded his hands behind him, and stood for a moment longer. Then, without comment, he turned and walked the corridor, his footsteps sounding where none had dared walk since war had made memory a fixture of the furniture. Francis Linton occupied one of the smaller drawing rooms as though he had decorated it himself. The placement of his legs, the angle of the newspaper on the side table, the untouched glass of sherry, all gave the impression of someone comfortably settled, though no one had seen him speak more than a handful of words since breakfast. Battle entered without ceremony, and took a chair that faced no mirror. He asked a question, gentle, neutral, about Linton's acquaintance with Miles Carrow. Linton's reply was smooth, cultured, and hollow. A few dealings in town, nothing lasting. He had a certain enthusiasm. Not always disciplined, but clever. He smiled as he said it, but the smile hovered a fraction too long and did not soften the eyes. Battle offered no contradiction. He merely listened, noting the faint twitch at the corner of Linton's mouth when Miles's name was mentioned in the past tense, and the momentary pause before he used the word clever. Grudges, in Battle's experience, did not always rise to the level of hatred. They were quieter, older things, polished by time, and fed on silence. Georgina Darracott received Battle in the rose parlor, her perfume heavy with something not quite floral, a scent both stately and faintly medicinal. She reclined on a fainting couch in the way women did when they wished to appear informal, but not at ease. Battle made his inquiry in measured tones, asking about her expectations regarding the estate. She laughed, lightly, a sound without warmth. "Oh, Superintendent, my expectations are a thing of the past. I was once quite young here, you know, but the house is old, and the family older. We become decorative, not decisive." Still, when he mentioned the revised will, her fingers twitched, just once, against the lace fringe of the settee. She reached for her glass, though it was empty. Her next sentence was airy, dismissive, but Battle observed the edge to her voice, not quite bitterness, but something layered beneath it, like the faded lining of an heirloom coat. She had not lost the house recently. She had lost it years ago, and never been permitted to mourn. Miss Vi met him on the terrace, her coat drawn tight, the collar turned up. It was not particularly cold, but the wind off the moors carried a restlessness, a memory of unfinished hours. When Battle inquired about her engagement to Miles, she answered without resistance. Brief, she said, not unhappy but misplaced. We were never meant to last. There was no self-pity in her tone, nor effort to cast blame. Her hands, gloved in grey wool, were clasped lightly in front of her. He needed something I did not have. Perhaps I lacked ambition, or cruelty. Whichever it was, he found it elsewhere. Battle said nothing. He looked instead at the hedge, just now beginning to brown at the edges. When she turned to go, she paused once more. "You've seen the portrait in the gallery?" she asked. That was the version of Colonel Carrow he preferred others to see. Then she walked inside. Her footsteps were deliberate, but not hurried. The hearth in the library had long since gone cold, the ashes grey and undisturbed. It was not until the third sweep that Battle's fingers touched something that resisted the brush. A corner of paper, scorched, curled, but not fully consumed. He eased it free. The ink had run, but the writing was still legible in parts. The name Miles Carrow was clear, as was the phrase "stipulations to be enforced upon finalization." Legal phrasing, clipped, impersonal, but the weight of it was not. Battle unfolded the edges further. The document had been folded into fourths, not eighths, suggesting recent handling, perhaps hurried concealment. The lower corner bore the faint remnant of a seal, half melted. He did not speak. He stood, brushed the soot from his hands, and tucked the fragment into a small envelope he kept in his coat. Then he looked again at the fireplace. Some fires burned clean, others resisted, and some refused to let the past burn at all. He found her in the portrait gallery, walking its length with the slow, careful gait of someone moving, not through space, but through memory. The Colonel's likeness watched from above, rows of men in frame, medals gleaming in oil, names etched beneath. Mrs. Carrow did not stop when Battle entered. Her fingers trailed lightly along the wainscoting. Her voice, when it came, was neither addressed to him nor entirely detached. "They are all here still," she murmured. "Not in the way the servants speak of, not footsteps or voices, but they linger. Every time I pass, I remember how they looked just before leaving, or just after not returning." Battle stood quietly, hands behind his back. She turned at last and faced him. "I brought them all here," she said. The words soft but deliberate. It had to be here, where it began. He asked nothing in reply. Her eyes had drifted back to the portraits, names that no longer held rank, only memory. Later that afternoon, in the stillness of the morning room, Battle asked her, gently, why she had not signed the will. She did not look at him as she answered. "He threatened me," she said. "Not with fists, not even with scandal, with memory." She fell silent, her gaze resting on a thread in the curtain hem. "When one's mind begins to age," she continued, "you do not fear death, Superintendent. You fear remembering too much, or not enough." She did not elaborate. Battle did not pursue the matter. Some statements were final in themselves, like the unread last page of a journal, left deliberately blank. The library stood empty. The fire had not been relit. Papers had been removed, chairs adjusted, but the air retained the weight of what had transpired. Battle stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He stood still, listening, not for sound, for pressure, for tension, for the subtle thrum of something waiting. The kind of silence that had tone. His gaze drifted to the bookshelves, their contents untouched, their dust patterns consistent, to the chair where Miles had sat, to the glass now rinsed and returned to the tray, but still suggestive of a man who drank out of habit, not thirst. Something in the room resisted completion, as though the space itself had not consented to finality. He turned slowly, once a full circle, and then he sat, folded his hands, and waited. He was not listening for a confession, only for the house to resume its breathing. The key was not requested. It was given. The housekeeper, a woman of careful silences and sharpened glances, placed it on the silver tray with the afternoon post. No mention made of where she'd found it or who had authorized its use. Battle took it without comment. The brass was darkened with age, its teeth unfiled and untouched for decades. The east wing had not been opened in years. The lock resisted, not with defiance, but from disuse, as if it had forgotten how to welcome movement. When it turned, it did so with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The corridor was narrow, the air dry and tinged faintly with old linen and something older still, a quiet, unwashed grief. Dust lay in settled lines along the edges of the skirting boards, undisturbed by human traffic. No footprints, no recent breath. Battle walked slowly, gloved fingers trailing along the wall. The past had been sealed here, not buried, merely waiting. The study was modest in scale, but heavy in presence. Not the sort of room that boasted rank or wealth, but one that enforced order. The walls were lined with military prints, some hung askew by time. A campaign map still stretched across the side table, its edges curled, its pinholes empty. The inkwell on the desk had dried mid-thought, the nib of the pen still touching the blotter. Battle observed the stillness with the faint reverence of a man entering a room kept for the dead, not by grief, but by duty. The armchair bore the faded impression of use, the fabric darkened in one place by a long-abandoned habit. On a nearby tray, the faintest trace of pipe tobacco lingered, sweet and stale in equal measure. He stood for a long moment without touching anything, allowing the room to speak first. Rooms, he knew, often confessed before the people within them did. The drawers beneath the desk were methodically arranged, correspondence bound in string, field reports dated and cross-referenced. Yet beneath one sheaf, tucked beneath a folder labeled expenditure, officer's mess, Battle found a small linen packet, tied with twine, its corners too sharp, its care too personal. Inside were letters, all unsent, each in Colonel Carrow's clipped hand, each addressed to either a senior officer, or more pointedly, a tribunal in Whitehall. The dates suggested an accumulation, written not all at once, but over weeks. The language was cautious, precise. Phrases such as irregular treatment of subordinates, conflicting accounts of field action, and discrepancy in witness testimony. No names appeared at first, but on the third letter, Miles's name appeared in passing, alongside another that had been crossed out so neatly it barely marred the line. Battle folded the letters again and placed them on the desk. The restraint in the writing was the most telling part. These were not the outbursts of a man aggrieved. They were the memoranda of someone attempting, vainly, to preserve order before decay became irreversible. The journal was a small leather-bound volume, its spine cracked, its pages foxed but intact. Colonel Carrow's handwriting was as Battle expected, narrow, economical, no flourishes. The entries were terse, observations more than reflections. There were notations on troop movements, officer conduct, requisition anomalies. But gradually the content shifted. A note on page 74 read, "Sharp's report does not align with the quartermaster's log." Then several pages later, repetition of excuses, undermining cohesion. Quiet contempt grows among ranks, no formal insubordination. Yet, one entry stood apart, underscored with a single line. They are protecting one another, but only one stands to gain. Two names were listed, Miles Carrow, and beneath it, only the initial E, followed by a line hastily scratched out. The ambiguity did not lessen its weight. Battle closed the journal and rested his hand on its cover a moment, not in sentiment, but to steady the pulse of a long-dormant signal beginning to resurface. It was a photograph, flattened behind a book on early artillery logistics, a volume untouched by time or interest. The image, once glossy, now bore the silvery sheen of age. 3 men stood together, shoulders almost touching, the background too blurred to anchor the scene. On the left, Colonel Carow, rigid in posture, expression unreadable. To his right, Miles Carow, younger by a decade, smiling with something too fixed to be genuine. Between them, slightly turned, was a man whose features had suffered water damage, his outline clear, his face half faded, yet the stance was defiant, almost challenging. Battle studied it without rush. Photographs did not lie, but they rarely told the whole truth either. On the reverse, faint pencil marks, Camp, Spring 17, E with us now, trust uncertain. The E again, the faceless man whose presence lingered behind every page, every ellipsis. Battle replaced the book, but kept the photograph, sliding it into his inner coat pocket, with the care of one storing evidence, not memorabilia. Mrs. Carow was seated in her usual chair beneath the great portrait of her husband, a shawl around her shoulders, despite the unseasonable warmth. Her eyes were not glassy but sharp, as if time had honed rather than dulled them. She began to speak before he posed a question. "He found them, you know, Miles. He found the papers." Her voice was soft, almost dreamlike. "He came to me the week before the gathering. Said he had read things that should never have been written. Said he would contest the will if I went through with it." Battle asked what he had threatened. Her gaze didn't shift. To tell everyone what Edmund had done. Not a bluff. He had the journal, the letters, but not the photograph. The fire crackled once in the hearth. She didn't look at it. "I brought them all here to end it," she murmured. "One way or another, that was the only decision left to me." Battle's question was quiet, not forceful. Mrs. Carow, who was Edmund? She blinked once, as if the name had broken something between thought and memory. Her hands, thin and motionless in her lap, gave the only sign, curling slightly inward. "There were so many EDs," she said, her voice barely audible. "Edward, Edmund, Edwin. They always died so young, didn't they?" He did not repeat the question. Instead he waited. The silence drew out, long enough that it became not absence but texture, weighted and resisting. She turned her face toward the portrait above. They were young men, most of them, too young to know what kind of men they were becoming. Battle did not press further. Her silence was not forgetfulness. It was something chosen, a refusal shaped by sorrow, not calculation. When she finally looked away from the portrait, her eyes held neither guilt nor innocence, only fatigue, like someone who had carried too many names for far too long. He arrived late in the afternoon, just as the fog began to thin into a reluctant drizzle. His coat was of rough wool, his hat tilted forward to shade a pale wind-scoured face. He carried no bag, offered no card, and gave his name softly, as though uncertain it still belonged to him. "Reverend Vale, retired of no parish," he said with a half-smile that did not quite reach the eyes. He asked only for shelter and spoke, with disarming simplicity, of once having known Colonel Carow. "A chaplain then," he said. "Field services mostly. I was with them through the autumn campaign. A bitter one." Mrs. Carow, when informed, granted permission without hesitation. Her tone held no surprise. "They always find their way back," she murmured, and returned to her reading. The servants, too well trained to speculate aloud, made up a room at the end of the east corridor. It had not been used in years, yet the Reverend did not complain. He accepted the worn sheets and the single candlestick with the gratitude of one who expected little and required even less. Battle offered no objection. He neither questioned the man's identity nor endorsed it. Instead, he resumed his circuit of the house, keeping to his usual pace, careful not to stir what had not yet risen. He observed, rather than questioned, and what he observed was not the stranger, but the room around him. Georgina Darracot's brief pause upon hearing the visitor's name, Linton's fingers tightening on his glass, Sharp's sudden decision to take his tea alone. Miss Vi was the only one who showed no outward response. She met the Reverend's eyes in the hallway, and inclined her head with the formality of one who had seen too many men return from places they never should have left. The stranger's presence did not dominate, but it unsettled. He asked no questions, yet the air around him seemed to expect answers. That Battle knew was often more dangerous. A man who questioned could be resisted. A man who simply remembered could not. It was the clock that woke them, not the wind. At precisely 4:07 a.m., a time known to no one except Superintendent Battle, and perhaps one other, the long silent grandfather clock in the hall gave a single low chime. Not two, not three. One solitary note, as hollow as it was precise. The sound travelled oddly, reaching each corner of the house with a different timbre. In Miss Vi's room, it sounded like the toll of something buried. In Linton's, it was sharp, metallic. Dora, in her attic bed, sat up at once, whispering, "It's broken. It's never worked." Battle, who had not yet slept, was already in the hallway when the echo died. He glanced at the clock. Its hands remained still, pointing as they had for years. 4:07. He did not approach. The silence afterward was denser than before, as though something had stirred, and now refused to return to stillness. The cry came an hour later, low, hoarse, muffled by the thick curtains of the master bedroom. Dora found her, half sitting against the headboard, her breath shallow, a stain of color high on her cheekbones that was not health. The tray rested on the side table, brandy glass, half full, spoon beside it, a carafe of water untouched. The bottle of laudanum had been returned to the medicine cabinet in the dressing room, neatly, as if it had never been taken out. Mrs. Carrow opened her eyes once, as the maid wiped her forehead. "He knew," she murmured. "He always knew." Then she slept. Battle examined the tray with clinical interest. The brandy was old, imported too fine to waste, but the dose had not been meant to kill, only to weaken, frighten. No one remembered who had delivered it. The housekeeper thought perhaps Dora. Dora was certain she had not. The footman had been cleaning the lower hall, and the Reverend, when asked later, merely said, "Some rituals repeat themselves whether we perform them or not." By morning, the Reverend was gone. His room was empty. The bed, made, the candle burnt down to its brass lip. A note had not been left. The front door had not been unlocked, yet his coat was no longer hanging, and the shoes, well polished though cracked, were gone from the mat. The only evidence of his presence lay inside a wooden box, placed carefully on the chair beside the writing desk. It contained a folded stole, a tattered prayer book, and a smaller parcel wrapped in wax paper, tied with string. There was no note to explain the gift, no name affixed, only silence. Battle examined the box, lifted the topmost items, and set them aside. Beneath, wrapped in a yellowed sheet of paper, lay several photographs and a thin sheaf of manuscript pages, written in a cramped, inconsistent hand. The Reverend had vanished without a word, but he had left something behind, a reckoning perhaps, or its final footnote. The photograph was brittle at the edges, as if handled too often by someone with too little care left to spare. 3 faces, one missing. The center had been torn out, roughly, as though emotion, not discretion, had ruled the hand that destroyed it. Of the remaining 2, one was clearly Colonel Carrow, the other, less certain. Youthful, smiling, but only with the mouth. On the back, written in pencil now faint with age, A single word remained legible. Edmund, not a full name, not a date, no place, just a name, deliberate, weighted, final. Battle stared at it longer than necessary, not because it revealed anything, but because of how little it attempted to. The omission spoke more clearly than the face ever could have. The removal of identity was never accidental. He set it aside gently and turned to the manuscript, his expression unchanged. He had known it was coming. The only surprise was in how long it had taken to arrive. The confession was not signed with flourish. It was printed, not cursive. Anonymous, though the details left no doubt as to the writer's presence in the regiment. It told of a betrayal, not violent, not public, but slow and deliberate. A transfer delayed, a testimony altered, a signal ignored. The result: 3 men executed for cowardice, 2 of whom had begged for reconsideration. One of the 3 had been Miss Vi's fiancé. The writer had not intervened, had watched, had chosen silence over consequence, and now, at the edge of age and breath, he had chosen silence no longer. Battle read it through once, then folded it and placed it with the photograph. He did not speak, nor shift in his chair. Some truths arrived long after they were useful, others arrived exactly when they meant to destroy. They were already seated when Battle entered, though no invitation had been extended. The drawing room, lit faintly by the overcast sky and one reluctant fire, seemed smaller than it had days before. The chairs had been shifted, not by staff but by instinct, angled away from one another, grouped not in comfort but in caution. Georgina Darracott sat nearest the fire, one hand clasped tightly around a handkerchief that had not once touched her eyes. Francis Linton occupied the corner furthest from the windows, legs crossed in practiced detachment. Sharp stood rather than sit, arms folded, eyes fixed on the mantel as though he could burn the carving into memory. Miss Vi, alone in her composure, sat with hands folded in her lap, unmoving. Mrs. Carrow was not present. She had been informed, but had not descended. Whether from illness or intention, none could say. Battle entered without ceremony. He neither cleared his throat nor gestured for attention. He merely stood near the far wall and looked at them in turn, each in silence, each in the shared knowledge that something had been decided. The stillness deepened, not with fear, but inevitability. Battle spoke without emphasis, and it was not explanation he offered, but chronology. There was foxglove in the ashes, he said, and in the port, not much, enough to begin a process, not to end it swiftly. He allowed the words to rest. Linton shifted slightly in his chair. Miss Darracott did not move. Digitalis purpura, he continued. Common name foxglove. The leaves are toxic in the wrong quantity, but in measured doses, a battlefield remedy. Calms the heart, slows the pulse, eases pain when morphine cannot be spared. He did not say whether he approved, he merely presented it as fact, in the same tone one might use to describe rainfall or the shifting of seasons. In the last war it was used quietly, by doctors, by nurses, sometimes with permission, sometimes without. Battle turned his head slightly. His eyes found sharp, lingered, then moved on. In this case, it was not administered as mercy. Not entirely. It was a message, carried in the scent of an old fire and the bitterness of a glass never finished. The room, so recently a stage for polite grievance, now held only silence. The execution of 3 men in 1970, Battle said, his voice still without heat, was filed as lawful. The charge cowardice, under fire. The proceeding expedited. He moved to the hearth, glanced once at the iron grate. Of the 3, only one protested his innocence. A young man, no record of desertion, no prior mark. A nurse, Matilda Vale, submitted a letter on his behalf. The letter was never entered into record. Miss Vi's hands tightened once, then resumed stillness. The tribunal included 3 officers, 1 has since died, 1 vanished from public life. The 3rd remained, shielded by name, by family, by the natural erosion of memory. Miles Carrow did not act alone, but he ensured the inquiry was closed. The chaplain, who arrived and departed without notice, was present that day. He submitted a confession. Battle took a small folded paper from his coat. He did not open it. Miss Vi's fiancé was among the condemned. He was executed without full review. There was a request for delay. It was denied. The final signature on the order was Carrow's. His eyes moved once more to the faces before him. Justice did not reach him, so something else did. She stood without invitation. Her figure was composed, unshaking, as if the admission had already been spoken long ago, in the solitude of 100 unshared days. "I found the journal a year ago," she said, "in the east wing behind the cabinet, wrapped in a coat I once helped him fold." No one interrupted. He had written of it. The tribunal, the vote, the letter from Matilda. He had destroyed it. I knew then, I had suspected for years, but now I knew. Her voice was not bitter, only resolute. "I came back, because I wanted him to hear it, from me. That I knew, that it was not forgotten." Her gaze did not waver. "I did not come to kill him. Not at first, but when I saw how easily he sat in that chair, as though nothing ever touched him." She trailed off, but the sentence needed no completion. "I brewed the tea," she said simply. "The port was untouched. I placed the foxglove in the hearth, so he would smell it, before it worked. That was all I wanted." She folded her hands once more. It was not justice, but it was the only thing left to do, and with that, she resumed her seat. Battle remained standing, though the air had begun to shift, less charged, perhaps, but not yet at rest. He did not correct her. He did not confirm. Instead, he drew a slow breath and let his gaze pass once across the assembled guests. "Mrs. Carrow," he said, "invited you all not for remembrance nor for reconciliation. She called you here because she believed the house could no longer hold what it knew, not in silence." The words were not theatrical. They had the weight of dust finally settling. She prepared a will. She prepared documents. She withheld a signature, not from indecision, but from necessity. If she had signed, there would be no reason to bring you here, no occasion, no confrontation. The house would remain silent. The clock would not chime. His gaze settled briefly on the fire, then back to the group. She knew that whatever had happened in 1917 had not ended there, that the story had continued, in her nephew, in the inheritance, in the portrait above the piano. He paused, and so she set the stage, not for comfort, but for confession. There was no response, no shift of movement. The room had entered that strange stillness only old houses and long-buried secrets could produce, the silence, not of relief, but of recognition. No orders were issued, no handcuffs shown. Yet when the time came, Miss Vi stood without hesitation. She gathered her gloves, which had rested on her lap throughout the proceedings, and smoothed the fingers with the care of habit rather than necessity. Georgina Darracott rose and turned away toward the window, her shoulders lifted as if bracing against cold. Linton remained seated, but his hand had moved, for the first time, to the watch chain at his waist, as though recalling something overdue. Sharp lingered at the edge of the room, watching the back of the room more intently than the people within it. Miss Vi crossed the threshold without assistance. Outside the drawing room, the hall stretched wide, the air cooler, emptier. The only figure present was the footman, silent and still, who did not look at her as she passed. Her steps were slow, neither proud nor shamed. When she reached the portrait, she paused. Colonel Carrow stared out, unaltered by age or consequence. His expression, precise, uncompromising, offered no absolution. Miss Vi lifted her chin slightly, as if meeting a gaze only she could see, and then walked on. No one followed immediately. The echo of her steps continued for some time. The house emptied slowly, as all large houses do when filled with grief that has no ceremony. Tea was cleared. Carpets were swept, though no one had tracked in mud. The windows remained half-shuttered. Battle stood alone in the main hall, his coat still folded over one arm, though the cold had grown noticeable. He stood beneath the clock. Its face was unchanged, the hands forever halted at 4:07. He studied it not as a timepiece, but as a witness. It had heard the footsteps of young men in uniform, the rustle of correspondence never sent, the steady breath of Mrs. Carrow pacing long after midnight. It had heard silence when words were owed, and stillness when guilt should have cried out. Battle did not attempt to touch it. Some things were meant to remain as they were, not from reverence, but from truth. The clock's silence had once marked a death. Now it marked what followed, the long echo of something buried improperly. He turned, eventually, and walked back toward the library. The weight in his step was not fatigue. It was knowledge, the kind that arrives too late to save, but just in time to haunt. Some stories ended quietly, others simply stopped. The truth, when it came, rarely restarted anything. She made no protest. When Miss Vi entered the library, it was without ceremony, without even the faint air of reluctance that might have softened her composure into pathos. Her gloves were already removed, folded precisely as if she had anticipated the moment long before it arrived. The ticking absence in the room, the muted corners, the dry fireplace suited her stillness. She did not sit, but stood by the long table where the colonel had once written letters no one dared read aloud. There was no need to summon her, she had not fled, no case of slippers by the door, no missing coat. Just her presence, unguarded and strangely final. When the local constable arrived, announced by the subdued murmur of a maid and the apologetic shuffle of boots, he found her precisely where Battle had said she would be. Her hands were at her sides, her mouth neither firm nor trembling. "I'm ready," she said. Nothing more. Battle had left her there, not out of cruelty, but because he knew she understood. The act was complete. The silence that had preceded it stretched behind her like a corridor of unopened doors. Whatever guilt or clarity she possessed, it would remain hers, unsentenced, unspoken, but acknowledged all the same. The dawn was cold but without drama, no wind rattled the panes, no cry escaped from the staff. Only a hush deeper than the ordinary quiet of an old estate spread outward from the upstairs corridor. Dora, the maid, found her first, still but not lifeless in any crude sense. Mrs. Carrow had always seemed as if death might one day visit her without needing to speak its name. Now it had. With precision, with restraint. A closing of eyes rather than a struggle for air. The fire in her room had long since gone out. Her bed remained unslept in, the coverlet folded precisely to the waist. She had sat in the high-backed chair, her father's, once, and allowed the night to unspool before her. On the small table was a glass of water, untouched. The unsigned will, placed in an envelope, but not sealed, lay beside it. Its pages fluttered slightly in the draught, but the signature line remained blank, as if it had waited too long, and the decision had passed beyond paper. Dr. Kemp was summoned, and arrived with his usual brevity. No struggle, he said. No pain, just stopped, and so it had. Battle came up later, not immediately. He stood by the window and looked out onto the grounds. There were no footprints. The frost had settled evenly across the lawn. "She timed it, I think," he murmured at last. "Or she waited until it couldn't be delayed." He did not touch the will. Some things, when left unsigned, speak louder than signatures ever could. The legalities unspooled with indifferent speed. Mr. Swithenbank, grey-faced and efficient, confirmed what Battle already suspected: the most recent draft, unsigned, held no legal standing. The older testament, filed decades earlier and long superseded in intent if not in law, offered little guidance. The named heir, Miles Carow, was dead and discredited. There remained no living kin with a claim that could stand unchallenged. And so the estate, its holdings, its quiet decaying grandeur, defaulted to statute. Mrs. Carrow's long-standing, though informally maintained, affiliation with the Veterans Remembrance League provided a path. The trust, respectable, apolitical, and above question, became the inheritor of Elcombe Hall and all that it contained. There were no objections. Francis Linton declined to make a statement. Miss Darracott left that same morning with a single valise and a maid who never met the gaze of anyone on the way out. The staff were informed that their positions would end at month's close, with severance arranged by the solicitor. The news passed without comment through the village. Old properties changed hands. Titles drifted. Legacies, like names on war memorials, faded not with malice but with time. What Elcombe had meant was no longer owned by the living. It was not the weight of law that held Battle there longer than necessity, nor the comfort of resolution. It was the sense, ill-defined yet undeniable, that something remained incomplete. And so, after the last departure, and the closing of the back stair door, he found himself once more in the great hall, beneath the grandfather clock. It had not moved, of course it had not. The hands, locked forever at 7:04, stared down with mute solemnity. Dust lay undisturbed across its base. The pendulum, if it had ever swung in earnest, now hung like a dead weight behind the glass. Battle did not glance at his watch. Time was no longer measured here in minutes. It was measured in absences of names unsaid, of faces no longer present, of guilt carried like old medals in drawers no one opened. He looked upward, not to the time, but to the quiet it imposed. A kind of witness, the clock. It had observed without interpretation. It had heard footsteps, gasps, sobs perhaps, and now it stood mute, an elegy shaped in brass and silence. He stood there a long while. Some memories cling to faces, others to places, but the deepest lodge elsewhere, beneath skin, beneath habits. Battle had seen them many times before, in officers whose hands shook only after their medals were pinned, in maids who never looked you in the eye, even when innocent, in widows who forgot birthdays but remembered screams. Memory, he often thought, did not respect logic. It was not ordered like an investigation. It had its own rhythms. It settled into houses like damp, into the spine of letters never posted, into the hush before a person speaks and decides not to. Elcombe was full of such memory, not just of war or murder but of other things: shame, cowardice, hesitation, the long drawn-out moments where someone could have acted and chose silence instead. Those were the memories that festered. He looked back once more at the staircase. The tread Miles had taken the night before his death. The corridor Miss Vi had walked with such composure. The room where Mrs. Carow had sat in her father's chair and waited for silence to reclaim her. There were places where memory could be forgotten. Elcombe was not one of them. Was it justice? Battle did not allow the word to form aloud, but it turned over in his mind like a coin worn smooth. Not every wrong was punished. not every victim honored, not every silence broken. Miss V would stand trial, yes. There would be statements, expert testimony, perhaps a plea. But what had been avenged was not a matter of law. It was older than statute, a man falsely executed in France, a betrayal written but never sent, a woman whose grief fermented into purpose and then into poison. Was that justice? He could not say, nor would he. The law moved, it always did, but truth remained less obedient. It surfaced not when summoned, but when its own peculiar clock struck. He stepped outside. The air sharp with late autumn, the wind dry and unyielding. Behind him, the house stood watchful. In the end, it was not guilt that lingered, but the question, and perhaps that, Battle thought, was the greater sentence. The wind moved through the empty halls of Elcombe, as though remembering what the living tried to forget. But tell me this, was Miss V's act one of justice reclaimed, or vengeance cloaked in the softness of grief? I'd like to hear what you think. Share your thoughts or theories in the comments, and if you found yourself drawn into this quiet unraveling of truth, do stay a while, like the story, share it with another curious soul, and subscribe for more mysteries best told in silence.